everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here for the launch of Amelia Horgan's new book, the latest in our Outspoken by Pluto series, Lost in Work, Escaping Capitalism. My name is Verishka Selbach. I'm the managing director of Pluto Press, and I'm very proud that we're publishing this book and hopefully learning from it as well. Publishing books like this is important for us. As an anti-capitalist publisher, we grapple every day with the very uncomfortable position of operating in a capitalist world. We are an employer, but you can't publish a book like this and not be aware of what it's saying. Books like this demand more from us. This book tells a story of how work stole our lives and what we can do about it. It poses three big questions. What is work? Why is it so bad for so many of us? And what can we do about it? We have a brilliant panel for you tonight, and we love reading your comments. So please ask our panelists questions in the chat. You can tweet on the hashtag #LostInWork, and you can buy a copy from plutobooks.com. Attendees of this event get 20% off using the coupon #LostInWork at the checkout. Well, that's enough from me. So over to you, Josh.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for attending this evening, and also thank you very much to Pluto for hosting this. I'm really excited for this event tonight. I'm going to be your chair. My name is Josh Gabert-Doyon. I'm a journalist and a radio producer. I tend to write and focus on work and tech. Tonight, we'll be speaking with Amelia Horgan, who is the author of Lost in Work. We'll be hearing from Kat Sinclair and Kulsoom Jafri. It's going to be a kind of loose, casual discussion. We're going to have kind of 10 minutes from, or five to 10 minutes from each panelist, and then going to do some questions for maybe 15 minutes, and then we're going to have audience questions as well. If you want to put anything throughout the talk into that comment box, that would be great. And we're going to be wrapped up by 8:15, so people can go have dinner or go back to work or do whatever they want to do. Just as a little bit of context first, I'll give biographies for each panelist. We'll hear from Amelia first, so I guess I'll do Amelia first. Amelia is a writer and researcher, author of Lost in Work, which people should go ahead and buy if you haven't already. She's a PhD student at Essex with a focus on philosophy. And after that, we're going to hear from Kulsoom, who's an organizer with the International Transport Workers Federation, the Seafarers branch, working with, among other people, tugboat captains or tugboat workers, as I understand it. And she previously worked with the IWGB in Bristol. Kat Sinclair is a poet, the author of Very Authentic Person. She's a tutor and PhD student at Sussex, researching the political economy of feminized robots. And she's also an organizer with the Devil's Dyke Network. A couple of pieces of context I might throw into the mix before we kind of get going on the talk. It's funny with work because as kind of well-established or kind of, as Amelia points out in this book, neutral as work is often seen, it's also really contentious. It's contentious as a topic because we tend to project a lot onto work in various ways. The same that we might, I guess, with a lot of sort of big categories, they get loaded with a lot of our own shit. And that's part of what's, part of the source of a lot of criticism of the post-work movement and kind of post-work set of demands. People tend to say, well, post-work, it's often criticized as being, not taking into account the way that people get a lot of fulfillment out of the work that they do. I think that in a large part, that's a really kind of unfair criticism. It's one that I've definitely dabbled in a little bit because it does often feel hard to reconcile the fact that, the set of demands around a 4-day work week, for example, don't always line up with our day-to-day reality where we seem to kind of get a lot out of work. And so I think that one thing that Amelia's book does, which is a really useful introduction, is just kind of takes a serious look at what work is at all, what work is kind of in the first place. And I think that's a really kind of crucial point. in trying to just investigate sort of the emotional texture of work, of the misery associated with work, and through that kind of understanding actually what we're talking about when we're talking about work, what we're talking about when we're talking about fulfillment, is a really important step in kind of coalescing around a strategy to change it. So yeah, I mean, Amelia really rightly points out in this book that there's this dominant mythology of work, which posits it as a kind of place where our desires are fulfilled, where they're met, rather than a place where our desires are frustrated, which is what work is for the kind of vast majority of us. I also want to kind of flag up another key argument that Amelia makes here, to offer some context for people that maybe are not so into these discussions, which I know can be sometimes feel a little bit exclusive, but really shouldn't be. There's been this kind of trend of thought within a lot of labor reporting, particularly in the last couple of years, but also more broadly in academic literature around precarious work. And the idea of precarity as a kind of defining characteristic of neoliberalism. And I think what Amelia does in this book, it's a kind of really useful, maybe corrective or a way of like opening up a category, is thinking about the fact that yes, some work is more precarious than others, and precarious work has its own kind of emotional texture in terms of kind of paranoia and anxiety, but also that work that is sort of non-precarious, that might be more secure, also shares these qualities of drudgery, of lack of control. And while security of employment is certainly like part of how we should understand good work, precarious work isn't just a bad apple, or seeing it as a bad apple maybe has some risks. And I think that loss in work really tries to remedy that. Again, by kind of opening up the category of work and thinking about the ways that we suffer at work, I guess. And I think, as grim as that might sound, it actually does it in a very generous and very useful way. I'm going to kind of just push it along here and maybe just note one thing to also kind of watch out for in this book when you do go ahead and buy it, is that this book gestures towards kind of ideas of worker self-management, of a more democratized workplace, where we have a say in how we work, which I think is a really important sort of demand. What we've seen, particularly in the last couple of decades, but particularly, kind of recent history, is this sort of non-hierarchical workplace, the open concept office, the cool manager, staples of this kind of post-Fordist kind of workplace. It doesn't in itself lead to fulfilling work, because we still don't have control over our work. And I think that that's something that is a kind of missing gap that this book really fills in. And I also want to, just point out that one thing I really loved about this book was the sort of anecdotes and testimony. As somebody that works in radio, kind of oral history testimony that kind of gets into this book through some really lovely quotations that are a really interesting way of kind of staging and dramatizing and bringing these ideas to life. With that, I'm going to pass it off to Amelia, and then after about 5 minutes, we're going to hear from the other panelists and then go into some questions, as I mentioned. Thank you so much again for everybody for coming.
Thank you so much for such a wonderful introduction. I think you've really summarized what the book is doing so brilliantly there. And I'm so excited to be here with such smart people who've got so many interesting things to say about the kind of theoretical side of work, as well as practically around organizing. So I'm going to keep it quite brief and just talk about what I'm trying to do with the book. The first thing I want to say is that the book, I've got it here, so I'm going to show it as is kind of mandatory, so you know what it looks like. The book, as with the others in the Outspoken series, is a book which is supposed to be accessible, right? And I think there's often a idea of accessibility as, not serious and not enmeshed in these debates. But actually, I think what we want to do with accessible text is start with the stuff of everyday life, start with people's everyday existence and build from that into the theory. So it's not to say that this theoretical stuff is somehow separate, right? These things kind of do come back in, and especially with books for young people, which the Outspoken series is, there's this idea that it doesn't really matter where you start. You can start with any kind of idea as long as it's accessible. And you see this a lot, especially with feminism, right? You see it doesn't matter where people begin as long as they start thinking. But I actually think the starting places where you choose to start, the path you begin on, is really, really important. And what that looks like in the way that, it's not just the kind of form of the ideas being explained, it's the content themselves that's really important. And I hope what I've done with this book is take probably the most one of the most significant features of capitalism, which is the experience of wage labor, and use that, which is a common experience for most people, and use that to kind of think about what capitalism is, how we live, how we relate to each other, and the way in which it keeps us unfree, and the way in which work and capitalism create particular subjectivities, create particular possibilities for people while curtailing others. So it's a book about work, but it's also a book about freedom, and the ways in which we are unfree at work, and the ways in which work and capitalism and capitalist work stop us from being free generally. So I try and answer 3 questions. The first one is, what is work? And that seems like a simple question, but it's actually quite complicated. There's often attempts to kind of expand the concept of work, and I consider whether these are helpful. For example, social production theory, and I consider kind of things which we might see as more misapplications of work, and try and untangle what we're talking about. Are we talking about work? Are we talking about effort? What is it that makes work work? What is this thing capitalist work? Without just saying, oh, so-and-so has used this wrong, that's incorrect. To think about why it is that these concepts kind of creep like this, why it is that so much of our life feels like work, or why that is the kind of dominant affect, even if we might say, okay, as good Marxists, we know this isn't work in this sense. So that's the first question. The second question is, why is it bad? And I do try and consider, there's a bit of a puzzle here, which is that we know that work does make people sick. Workplace stress is very serious. Workplace injuries are common, and not as common as they were, but the decrease of them has really plateaued. And people are frustrated at work, but at the same time, a lot of people report enjoying their jobs. So it's not enough to say, okay, people obviously hate work. The story is a bit more complicated. So it's thinking about what exactly is it about work that is bad. So there's a story there of exploitation. There's a story there of value that is created and then kind of funneled off. But there's also a story, and I think Josh is very right to point to this, of the way in which demands for freedom in the workplace have been kind of co-opted. So you have these fun workplaces, these kind of Luddic workplaces where you have like a slide, where you have, beer and pizza, and it's hard to imagine exactly what these kind of workplaces are, but you get like a wellness pack, you get this kind of stuff. And what's really fascinating in these workplaces is that actually, even though the kind of content of the messaging and the free gifts is different, there's something underlying it. There's this principle that you're responsible for managing your human capital. So you go home and you do this wellness pack, or you do the meditation app that your employer has given to you, right? And it's probably of a high quality. They might give you some very expensive pillow spray, for example. But it's the same kind of message that people at the other end of the workplace kind of spectrum are being given, which is that you are responsible for making sure that your human capital, that your labor power comes to work in the right way. And we saw this with this kind of leaked leaflet from Amazon, which was basically, which they denied as being theirs, but the messaging was like, you are an industrial athlete. You need to make sure you're wearing the right shoes. You need to make sure it's drunk enough. You need to be doing this and this. And it's like, well, actually, really, in both cases, the reason for workplace stress is the dynamics of the workplace, right? Like, you can obviously have better and worse responses to that as a worker, but you're not the one making the decisions about what the pace of work is like, what the conditions of the workplace are like, when people are expected to leave. That is not kind of in your power. So there's this pushing of responsibility down to the worker. And then the final question is a hard one, which is, what do we do about it? So in this section, I try and say there are things we can do while retaining capitalism that would massively improve work, right? So there's clearly better work. Better work is possible without, we can raise the floor significantly, but fundamentally, exploitation, a lack of workplace democracy. These are things which, these dynamics belong to capitalist work. We can make them more or less bad kind of within it, and there are kind of experiments we can do to improve it. But the experience of exploitation, of alienation, of drudgery belong to a particular property regime. So the way out of it is to change power, to change ownership. And that sounds like it's a kind of, obviously not an easy thing to do, right? It's a very hard thing to do, and requires a long, hard slog. And in this, I speak about dynamics of the labor movement, current tactics, thinking about, how do we do struggles in the modern workplace? How do those look? Do those look different? How do we do kind of struggles within the terrain of social reproduction, or workplaces that are also socially reproductive workplaces, right? How do we do that? And there's lots of interesting stuff there, and I'm sure we'll talk more about that. Yeah, I think what I want to do with the book is try and problematize something which is seen as pretty natural, or seen as something which, the problem is that there are some bad jobs. We need to get rid of those bad jobs. But to say, actually, of course there are better jobs. It would be completely bizarre for me to say, no, all the jobs are equally bad. That's obviously not true, right? But it's not just a problem of changing the access to those good jobs. It's a problem of power. It's a problem of the property relations of capitalism. I'm going to leave it there. And yeah, I'm sure we'll pick up some of these threads coming through.
Indeed, we will pick up some of these threads in the question and answer period. But now I'm going to turn it over to Kulsoom to kind of give a little intro as well.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much. Thanks to everyone at home for tuning in, and to my fellow panelists and the organizers, and of course to Amelia for inviting me on this evening. I'm so excited to be here for this launch and, to promote such a fantastic book. So coming from a trade union background, I'm going to focus most of my time discussing just that and try to contribute to Amelia's very important third question: what can we do about freeing ourselves from work? So Amelia's book does a stellar job of outlining how unions and collective bargaining agreements benefit workers. She's truly done my job for me in convincing you of the importance of a union and collective action. And so I feel like I have very little to add on that front. But what does pique my interest is the limits of trade unionization and the struggle for emancipation for work. So in Lost in Work, Amelia correctly reminds us that trade unions have been and will be vitally important to winning and protecting gains for workers and for building working class power. But she points to two important limits of the scope of union activity. She quotes Hugh Bainon, and I believe this quote deserves the utmost attention. Trade union activity in itself is manifestly incapable of altering the entire raison d'etre of capitalist enterprise. Even though the reason for being of capitalism will vary depending on who you ask, I want to reference a cultural theorist, Albina Asmanova. She argues that the core feature of capitalism is competitive production for profit, and that is the thing that must be undermined for our political economy to move beyond capitalism. So really simply, all companies are in competition with other companies to win the highest share of profits. Competitive production of profit is a logic that governs our economic order, and that's what needs to be overthrown if we want to win a post-work world. If you're here listening, I probably don't need to convince you to overthrow capitalism, and there are a variety of reasons why competitive production of profit is dangerous to our society. But one point I would like to stress tonight is that as long as production is geared toward competition for profits, it forces unions to fight with one hand tied behind our backs in an effort to seek justice for workers. The limits of unionization stem from the fact that the welfare of a union member is ultimately tied to the welfare of the company that employs them. This creates a natural barrier of how far the demands of rank and file organized labor can actually extend. That our economy is organized around the competitive production of profit means that firms are under incredible pressure to be profitable. Lack of profitability or declining profitability threatens these companies. And for my Marxists out there, we know that businesses generally maintain profitability by attracting customers with low prices. And the secret to those prices is keeping costs low, including labor costs. Low pay and no benefits are good for the firm's bottom line. This rule for businesses creates a hostile relationship between employers and employees because we have opposing interests. Business want the highest volume and quality of work for the least compensation, whereas workers want the best possible terms and conditions for the least volume of work because we're lazy, obviously. Amelia eloquently explains the reasons the employer is better positioned to win this battle. The function of a union is to artificially restrict the supply of our work, which results in raising the bargaining power of workers, giving us the ability to negotiate better terms of contract. But here's the kicker. A union's demand can only go so far as they don't threaten the profitability of the business that employs them, because doing so might bring down the business on which we depend on for income. In this sense, both the employer and the worker have a shared interest because competitive production for profit rules over us all. The subjection of all or nearly all economic actors to this logic is what makes it a form of systemic domination. The pressure to be profitable is faced by everyone, firms who are beholden to banks, shareholders, venture capitalists, and so on. So what I mean by unions having to fight with one hand behind their back is that we cannot fully resist exploitation. Organized workers can never claim 100% of the surplus value they create because we endanger our own employment. By removing the pressure to be increasingly profitable, we might open up the space for workers to break through this natural barrier. If increasing profitability wasn't a necessary achievement of the company, then workers could make stronger demands without fear of harming the institution on which we depend on for employment. So all this raises a question that is way beyond my ability to meaningfully answer. How do we reduce the pressure of companies to generate higher and higher profits? Even though I'm not an economist or a researcher, I have come across an idea that might be worth consideration. So let's quickly review where the pressure for profitability comes from. Capitalism is historically unique in that it is characterized by widespread propertylessness, forcing most people to obtain our livelihoods by selling our labor to a small property-owning minority. The wages paid to us allows us to buy the goods we need to survive. The obvious outcome of this arrangement is that a massive people labor to the advantage of a small minority of owners. Employment isn't charity. It's an opportunity for the property owners to exploit workers and further inflate their stock of wealth. In other words, the capitalist permits access to his property on the grounds that he is left with more in the end. The demand by the capitalist that the worker makes him richer is the core of how our economy works. A company must generate profits or it will cease to exist, as the owners of capital will no longer invest in continued operation, right? So the Walton family will never say, oh, that's enough profits, Walmart. They'll always demand more. There's no natural limit to how much profit they'll demand. People can acquire as much wealth as possible and they have no reason to stop. But what if we, the mass of working people, used our political freedom to put a limit on property ownership? This would have two important consequences. First, it would deconcentrate property ownership and reverse the widespread disposition inherent to capitalism. In other words, a limit on property ownership would mean that property is more widely and evenly distributed. Second, capitalists would no longer have a clear incentive for demanding ever-increasing profits from companies. If the capital-owning class has already reached maximum potential wealth, nothing is gained from a company's continued growth. This would theoretically decrease the pressure on companies to be profitable and ultimately afford unions a better standing to demand the full fruits of our labor. This is the central idea of a growing ideological movement called Limitarianism, which also has policy demands like a maximum income, a policy that actually finds surprising levels of support in Britain. Maybe that is one step that we can take towards shifting the consciousness around work and eventually becoming free from it. And before I close, I really quickly wanted to give a shout out that tomorrow is the International Day of the Seafarer, and for folks to just have a browse around any news or issues related to seafaring, because it's a very highly invisibilized sector and we could literally not function without it. All seafarers are key workers, essential workers that deserve our utmost solidarity now and always. So thank you.
Thank you for that. Up the seafarers, up the Suez. Kat, can we have you next a little 10 minutes to talk about the book and respond a little bit?
Hi, yeah, I'm going to repeat Kulsoom a bit here and saying thank you to everyone watching. Thank you to fellow panelists. Thank you so much to Amelia for asking me to speak. And thank you to Pluto for this fantastic series of books. Lost in Work is a wonderful edition, but they're all brilliant. And if this is your first book in the series, then I really, really encourage you to go back and read them all because they're brilliant. So my response here is a little bit notesy and piecemeal, but I'm going to try and stitch something together here. Because I really also like the anecdotal aspects of the book, in particular Amelia's acknowledgement of the conditions under which it was written. While writing it, she was suffering from long COVID, and it made me think of the conditions under which I was reading it and under which I've been living for the past year, thinking about the pandemic and the complex class politics of working from home. There are lots of ways in which working from home is a privileged position and a position of quite the opposite, depending on who you are. And class has a lot to do with that. The type of work you're doing has a lot to do with that. And I was working from home on my PhD, but I was also a full-time carer. And I've been a carer for the majority of my life. During the pandemic, this doubled up and I was caring for both parents at once. It made me think a lot about the concept of coping. And I think something that the book does really well is point out the ways that in which we cope. So it's great at pointing to the things that people do to get through the day and denaturalizing them, saying this is political, this is resistant, this is creating friction with capital. Once those acts of resistance are recognized as such, when they're harnessed and networked and they're developed and changed and reapplied, that's when organizing happens. That's when, to continue with the very hackneyed metaphor, there's enough friction to like spark something beyond just getting through the day. Scrolling back up. And this is why, linking back again to what Josh was talking about earlier, with the and then Amelia expanded on the fun workplaces. Coping gets kind of shoved under the rug a little bit there. It's that the things that we do to cope are made fun. They're made something that the workplace provides for us, and they're made they're made ludic, they're made supposedly empowering, and it's a kind of a neoliberal discourse of empowerment gets folded in here. We do wellness checks to empower ourselves. We do self-care to make sure that we feel strong enough to get through the day and we feel good individually. We go home and we you could call it social reproduction, you could call it self-care. We prepare ourselves for the next day of work, and then we get up and we face the day and we feel really good about it, or we're supposed to. And it's made into this individual atomized thing, the idea of coping, and it's repackaged and the rhetoric is changed, so that it's no longer coping, it's empowerment, and it's feeling great. And I find this ridiculous, because politically, empowerment is a collective act. It's not an individual feeling that emerges fully formed. So I don't empower myself, I'm empowered by others to do things, and that this can take the form of many people empowering one person to do something. For example, like silent complicity as the foundation of and justification for violence, or the empowerment of big bosses to make the decisions they do by just accepting that that is the way things are. Or it can take the form of networked empowerment, like unionizing, where we're all empowering each other mutually to take something, to take what we deserve to have. And so much of working life is coping, is getting through the day. We recognize that as an important act, and Amelia recognizes that as incredibly important in her book. I think it's chapter 7, talking about resistance at work, and a lot of those things are coping, but they are also small radical shifts in the way that we engage with our working day. But recognizing it as coping and then kind of waking up the next day and doing it all over again, to never move beyond that, is privileging the idea of individual comfort over collective action. The emphasis on the importance of kind of individual well-being, which is kind of promoted to us and sold to us, that we live in conditions in which that is privileged because we live under neoliberal capitalism. It quashes more forms of radical collective care and action. So I feel this in academia, as a kind of atomized PhD student working from home, and I very much felt it as a carer, not having the kind of access to networks of care and empowerment that, as well as not having access to much money because the carer's allowance is very, very small from the state. Working from home was a very complex thing for me because the things that I was doing to cope were all things that I was doing within the environment of my own home, and that they were complicated by the fact that I was occupying multiple positions at once of the idea of working from home. But the question that I think that this book raises for me in this context is why should our goal be to cope within the confines of capitalism? And why do we stop at managing to get through the day? And the what do we do about it section, I find particularly fascinating and useful for this, is the idea that it presents the idea that disparate mechanisms of resistance must be harnessed, and this is where the successes come from, right? I've got two particularly salient excerpts here that I thought Amelia could explain it better than I could. It's from chapter 7 on resistance at work. This is a short one. Without mass coordination of our frustrations, without social transformation, the best we can hope for is that our next job might be slightly less bad. And I think a more a microcosmic version of that is that the next day might be slightly less bad within the job that we already have. And the second quote from the conclusion, this relates back to the discussion about the gig economy and precarity and more stable work. While the underlying relations that make capitalism haven't changed, the ways in which those relations are lived have changed. This doesn't mean we should give up on the strategy of building the power of workers as a class, quite the opposite. But it does mean that the potential entry points for this movement may have shifted. When the majority of workers are employed in the service sector with its own pressure points different to those of industrial capital, new alliances and new tactics might need to be developed. So I think contextualizing that within the idea of individual coping mechanisms and how we get through the day and how we steal time or how we make our bodies hurt less, or we deal with our back pain, or we go to therapy and talk about our day at work. Those how do we harness those kind of methods of coping, that emphasis on the individual, and transform that into collective action, and think beyond coping, and why stop there? Ask that question, and then do we want to be constantly engaging in those mechanisms of coping? Do we want to be talking about work at therapy, or do we want to be doing something different? I suppose, and that is where collective action comes in. But the question is, what does that look like? And I think for me, I'm reading this book and I'm thinking, okay, there are traditional methods of labor organizing. There are traditional actions that we take in order to make change within a trade union, and there are ways in which those efforts are curbed. So why don't we look at the kind of individual actions we're taking each day and think, how can we collectivize those? How can we turn that coping into change? That was a bit all over the place. I think I hope I tied it together okay. But yeah, thank you so much for asking me to be involved in this. It's a really, really exciting event, and I'm looking forward to seeing more people's reactions to the book, because I think it's a really, really fantastic thing.
Thank you, Kat, for drawing together some of the dots there, and for bringing in your own experience, and I hope that throughout the kind of question period that we'll be entering now, and in the spirit of Amelia's book, and indeed in the spirit of this kind of Pluto series, but that people feel free to kind of invite their own experiences and with organizing or personal experiences into answering these questions, because I think that's really valuable, and even just how you might have arisen a ribbon at a kind of idea. I think that's really useful to throw in. So please, panelists, when answering questions, that'd be great. The thing I'm going to start with has to do with kind of coming off of that discussion of care that you brought up, Kat, and it has to do with what is laid out in Lawson work. This kind of reading of Otessa Moshfegh's Year of Rest and Relaxation, and this really kind of quite smart critique that Amelia takes up around kind of this liberal feminist idea of the end of housework, the end of emotional labor, and how that often means kind of outsourcing reproductive labor to migrant laborers. And I think that's a really important point when we're talking about questions of kind of rest and kind of this problem of rest, this problem of coming home after a day of work. And I guess the question sort of is how do we demand more rest and relaxation without outsourcing that labor to others? And I kind of wanted to also draw in. I was thinking about reading that section. How when I was growing up, a lot of the rich families in Canada where I grew up had Filipino nannies, because there was a deal that had been cut whereby people could have fast-tracked visas if they were doing nannying work. And so this was kind of a staple, but it was kind of really built into the sort of border regime of Canada. I think in a way that's probably is more prevalent and kind of is really important for thinking about these issues as well. I'm gonna just call on somebody to kind of answer it, but feel free to pass it off as well. But maybe Amelia, if you want to start, because that is such a great passage in this book where you kind of dive into that reading.
Sure. Yeah, I think the border regime and the role of global inequality in allowing for this, for the kind of passing off of this work, and that also means that the women who are employed outside the home, who are in these often high-powered jobs, are able to stay longer at work and be exploited more, right? So there's a kind of multiple levers there. There's global inequality, there's work intensification among the kind of the more elite, or at least we're kind of within the non-migrant global north kind of context. I think one thing that's always struck me as odd is that you walk down a street and you see these individual houses or blocks of flats, and every single house is doing the same thing, right? There's a massive duplication of a lot of this work. And that just seems like, so you have that, which either means, okay, so that means someone has to do it. So someone does it. Traditionally, it is like the housewife who does it, right? But nowadays, it's the housewife working for free, plus all of this like hyper exploited labor, often migrant labor, and it's some kind of mixture of those. And the thing that strikes me as bizarre is this is somehow kind of seen as progress, right? Instead, we need to think about how do we reduce the amount of work involved, right? So one way to do that is, and this has been done so kind of successfully, is that the standards of at-home domestic reproduction, social reproduction used to be much higher than they were. So imagine a kind of traditional silverware setup, right? Like this takes a lot more time. This seems like a kind of fatuous point, but I think it's perhaps significant. Reducing the amount of overall work required might look like lowering standards a little bit. The way in which kind of consumer needs are created around having the most perfectly spick and span house, the most kind of updated decor like all the time, right? Like all of this stuff, do we need it to be like that? That's one way, and that's pretty simple. That could be done at a household level. The next way is to think about how can we collectivize some or all of this work. It might not be desirable to collectivize all of it. There are some bits which people seem to find very important to be the product of one household. But there is clearly more we can do. And one of the things I talk about in the book is this architect who designed homes for single mothers. And these weren't perfect. They were designed kind of short term. They were there for when the children were young. But there's some interesting ideas that we could use from that, which is that there was one communal corridor, and you can see into it from every flat. So it doesn't need everyone to look after their own kids. A couple of people can look after the kids, can keep an eye on them very easily. Stuff like this would make a huge difference. It is reducing the level of intense involvement that like child rearing raises by collectivizing it a bit. That's one part. I think there's a lot we can do, but it's seen as the right way to provide social reproduction, or is within the home, or to pay someone else to do it and make it kind of invisible. So how do we reduce it? Well, okay, we can lower our standards, we can collectivize it. Yeah, and I think both would make a huge difference to people's lives. Yeah.
Kulsoom, can I maybe call on you? Just because I know that seafarers, this is a sector where migration is a massive issue, and outsourcing is a massive issue. Is there anything you kind of wanted to tack on there on this kind of problem of rest and relaxation?
Sure. Yeah. I think, I'm happy to dive into the seafarers bit, but I think just more generally, I think just increasing people's exit power is going to be a really important demand to be making from our employers. In the United States right now, everyone's going after Biden because his unemployment benefits are so high that people are choosing not to do low wage work. And I think that's absolutely brilliant, right? Like you should be able to not have a shitty job. And that's, that's something that could increase your rest and relaxation. When it comes to seafarers, obviously they work and live on the vessels that they're employed on. And their contracts could be from 1 month to 6 months. And then currently in the COVID crisis, seafarers have been stuck on their ships for 11 plus months, which is way over kind of regulation and standard. And for them, rest and relaxation doesn't really happen until they get home for 2 months, and then after that they're back on their boat. So really, when we think of rest and relaxation in kind of a 9-to-5 context, or a context where you get to go home every day, it just throws in a whole new challenge for workers who live where they work and are stuck there, really. But again, it's a resilient industry. Folks find ways to cope. They have exercise rooms, they're a community on the vessel, they play games and have entertainment evenings and things like that for themselves. But it is a struggle beyond just maybe being able to go home every day. So
great. And Kat, is there anything you wanted to add there?
Yeah, I think one thing that I always get stuck on here is the idea of convenience. I think that the capitalist harnessing of the word convenience is the greatest propagandist trick it's ever pulled. That everything has to be convenient, and I think it's not a replacement for good structures of care and access for people. Convenience is not just convenience is not what's needed, right? I mean, we talk about this in conversations about delivery drivers and things all the time. Like we'll say these are not good standards. People are not being paid well, and there are no support structures in place for them. And you'll hear back from from people who work at the companies higher up saying, well, people need their groceries delivered, people need their food delivered. Have you thought about disabled people? And it's not a good replacement for structures of care for disabled people who might need food delivered. And I think so that aside, just as a caveat there, I think moving back to the idea of rest and relaxation, rest and relaxation for whom? Because there's such a divide between who gets the rest, who gets to relax, and who provides the things which allow people to rest and relax. And I think just quickly, Amelia mentioning the idea of standards being lowered potentially in order for more people to rest and relax. I think maybe one of the answers is to do away with the prioritizing of convenience above all else. We don't need things delivered next day all the time. We don't need we don't need the silverware to be incredibly shiny. We don't need everything to be super convenient. And I technology has a lot to do with this in terms of like planned obsolescence and having to update things all the time and make sure that things are better than they were. It's this idea of constantly improving and constantly having the most convenient thing we can possibly have. And that means that more people have to provide the convenience, and a few people benefit from it.
I wanted to shift us a little bit to talk about boredom, because it's a pretty central facet to this book. I wanted to kind of probe it a little bit and investigate what it means to be bored. And I also kind of wanted to think about maybe how boredom has changed a little bit, because I think often we see, obviously boredom is boring. It's kind of like a very, very stable sort of category in a lot of ways. But I think it does kind of change over time in the way that we experience boredom has changed throughout the past couple of decades. So I guess I'm wondering if we could go around and kind of think about the ways that maybe that experience of boredom has changed since the kind of Fordist moment. Kat, I might actually bring it back to you if that's all right, just because I know your poetry has touched on kind of these questions of alienation before, and I think that's very very related in this instance.
How boredom has changed. I think a lot. That's an interesting one. I think again, I'll bring it back to the idea of speed and needing to update and needing to be constantly changing and doing something better or improving. That's an incredibly capitalist logic. It's progress, it's expansion, it's getting better all the time, and it's self-improvement. I think that it makes it impossible to relax. It makes it very easy to be bored. As we can, speaking from personal experience, when I'm not, it's one of those logics you have to kind of unlearn when you think, okay, well, I don't need to be being productive all the time. And that can quickly, what can fill that void is, oh, but I do need to be, making myself better. And doing nothing then becomes shameful, and it also becomes boring because you can't just lay around doing nothing. You have to be doing something that fills that direction to become better, to do better, to improve yourself in some way. Social media fills that void, and then you feel bad about it because social media isn't making you any better, unless you happen to get like a load more followers that day, and then that makes you feel better for a second. I don't know. I wasn't alive 60 years ago, so I can't say how the experience of being bored has changed. But I think that a lot these things must have something to do with it, with the continued creep of I must improve myself, and whether that be with wellness workshops or with apps or with obsessive reading, for example, like the gamification of everything we do, the quantification of everything. I don't know. Filling that drive. I'm going to stop there.
Thank you for that contribution. I definitely feel that self-improvement thing very, very acutely. Amelia, I realize that I've made a kind of a very broad question, but if there's anything you kind of wanted to pick up about boredom, maybe even if it's just kind of something, in the course of the research for this book, how your ideas of boredom changed.
I think boredom is a super interesting phenomenon, and I think it's worth thinking about how the experiences of boredom change over time, because the temporality of capitalism changes for different people in different times, and that seems kind of banal, but it's important to think about, right? We all know that the experience of time is different when you are a child, and waiting 10 minutes seems like impossible to now, when 10 minutes is over before you even like got your phone out, right? But if we think about the ways in which these kind of different temporalities exist in capitalism, and the different temporalities that relate to the division of labor and people's experience of work are important here as well. So surveillance at work curtails in some way the experience of boredom at work. So one of the things I found researching the book is that there's this big collection of basically workers' self-reported stories written in this kind of moment of high Fordism, collated by Ronald Fraser. It's really fascinating, but you definitely get the feeling that the dominant affect is boredom. People are, you know, the experience of the production line is obviously one in which like the speed of it is not in your control. So there's a particular temporal kind of domination there, but doing the same thing repeatedly, especially in kind of routine work, is different to the very intense surveillance and monitoring possible in technologically done work, in which like it's not that in previous roles people weren't surveilled, they were of course, but the possibilities are basically like 360 degrees of your life are surveilled, right? You are put on a bigger scale. Yeah, so I think the speed of capitalism as experienced, this isn't by everyone, because some people are outside of it, right? The speed of the temporality experienced by taxi drivers waiting to collect people to drive them between work is different, right? There are people who are paid to wait in some ways, and the temporality there is very different from the kind of precarious young professional who feels this constant urge to need to be working on themselves, right? And then the temporality is again different between people who are forced more directly, or the coercion is more direct. It's less kind of self-put on when say you are tied up in the kind of conditionality of the welfare benefit system, and you're being told you need to apply for this number of jobs. That's it. But it also involves that kind of self-surveillance and that kind of monitoring of the good deployment of your own human capital. But it's a different dynamic. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that the temporality of capitalism is really tied up with boredom. And I think for some people, things move so quickly that boredom can even seem like a luxury, right? You get all of these kind of yuppie retreats without phones. Like people want this kind of stimulation-free experience. That's something interesting there. There is this desire for being bored, but then at the same time, there are people who are paid to wait around, and their time is kind of at the beck and call of others. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting provocation to think about how boredom has changed, right? And how the experience of time has changed. Yeah, I think that's.
Kulsoom, do you want to talk boredom, or I can also throw another question at you?
Sure, I could just do a quick boredom thing. I just think, I'll probably just repeat what's kind of already been said, but it is very much a thing that you're not allowed to be, like you're not allowed to be bored. It is really the hottest commodity, right? Like eyeballs on screens make, lots of money for lots of social media spaces. And I think what's also, just looking at my own life, like, what am I doing while I'm bored? I'm playing like phone games that are also like work, like, the flipping burgers, and like, it's just ridiculous how you like tie in your non-work and relaxation time to boredom. It all kind of jumbles up into one in the end, doesn't it? So I won't say more, but go ahead, Josh, if you want to ask
I'll ask another question, and I'll bring it over to you. My question, I guess, has to do with the idea of what good work is, because Amelia kind of gives this definition of work that's secure and well paid and fulfilling. But when we kind of think about that question of what makes work fulfilling, it starts to get a little bit blurry, I think. And I was wondering, maybe trying to avoid kind of self-help cliches, but what is kind of what would your vision of fulfilling work be? I think it can sometimes be really hard to imagine what it would be in our kind of current set of circumstances. But particularly when we're thinking about like, yeah, we don't just want the next job to be slightly less bad, but like, should we be demanding more fun at work? That also seems kind of off. So what would you kind of imagine as a vision for fulfilling work, Kulsoom?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think, in my own experience, obviously, I have been very privileged to work for something I'm passionate about, right, in trade unionism. But that doesn't mean, everyone gets to do that, and people don't always get to do what they love. Even though, work won't love you back. Shout out to Sarah Jaffe too. But I think generally it is important to have all of the things Amelia has listed to make sure it's secure, gives you the time that you need outside of work as well. But ultimately, I think it's what you feel like you're contributing to the rest of the world, right? I think people who are happy in their jobs feel like that what they're doing is connected to a collective, to society, to something greater. And the most essential workers, key workers, they maybe do not get this respect and dignity from society despite contributing so greatly. And so I think, those are two things: how much you feel like you're contributing, but also how much dignity you're getting back. And I think dignity at work is probably a very fulfilling feeling to have.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Kat, what are your thoughts about kind of the demands for what fulfilling work might look like?
I think time is a big thing. We talk about like the 4-day work week, and we talk about being able to choose your work hours in a non-0 hours contract way. I think also space for honesty and honesty of emotion. I think one of the things that horrifies me most about work is the surveillance of emotion and the drive to produce some kind of desired emotion, or provoke a desired emotion in others. And we talk a lot about emotional labor. A few days ago there was a article that came out, I think it was about Canon, the camera company, about workers there being surveillance technology which measured how much they were smiling at work, and there was outrage about this, but it's not a new logic at all. It's one of the oldest ones, that you should look fulfilled even if you're not fulfilled. And I bring this up all the time. I talk about it all the time. It's this Trader Joe's, specifically in America, I have it. I think it's in their handbook. It might have been removed now. That the workers must perform not just happiness, but authentic happiness. It uses the word authentic, and that there's someone who was there's testimony from the article is probably still out there, from a guy who was fired for not looking authentically happy, as if his boss's manager could tell, like, you're smiling but you're not smiling well. And I think work should allow you the space to be miserable at work. Like, if it can still be good work, it could still be fulfilling work, you could still like your job and be miserable at your job. And I think some jobs do allow for that space. I mean, a lot of office work, you can complain about how bad a day you're having, as long as you're like filling out the spreadsheets. But a lot of work, service work, is probably the best example. You can't be miserable, or you can only within certain confines, and people will complain if you're not sufficiently happy. So I think that there's a big kind of detachment or dissonance between like feeling in the body and performed feeling, and this occupies a lot of space in emotional labor discourse, but I think it's becoming increasingly important in conversations about technology as well. So yeah, honesty I think is my contribution.
Amelia, do you want to take up that question, and then we'll kind of go over to audience Q&A, because I see there's some questions coming in already, and if anybody else wants to start adding, now's the time to do it. But Amelia, I'll let you respond to that first.
Sure, I'll keep it short so we've got time for audience questions as well. But I guess I would say it's not about the activity, because we can imagine people who are doing the thing they love, right? So say you loved playing the violin, you're a brilliant violinist, but you didn't get to choose the conditions under which you played it. Like they could still be good, but you didn't get to choose which pieces you played or where, and you're made to go from place to place, right? So it's not the activity so much as the control. And I think, just picking up on some of the things Kulsoom and Kat have mentioned, I think there's something about collective activity that's important there as well. So collectively doing things, shaping things. And also a worry I have about this authenticity stuff is that there's this demand for the authentic feeling at work and the sharing of authentic feeling. And this is really creeping with the demands of social media and this kind of very common discourse around authenticity and personality that comes particularly online, and seems like it's also growing, not to be all like these young people in these phones, especially like as a young person who often is on her phone, but I think the way that this is metricized and the way in which people are expected to share things and expected to kind of narrativize around themselves. And you see it at kind of job applications, you see it at university applications, these kind of demands on personality kind of creeping from the service sector and the work intensification there, and then spreading into more and more in life, and the way in which that might be corrosive to kind of social solidarity, and the way in which the demands of metricized versions of social interactions. So whether that is the the Uber driver who is rated, or the Instacart driver who has to appear in a certain way to get that rating to be picked next time, or whether that's like a lecturer who is being the data from student surveys is being used to kind of measure their performance, right? This has hugely troubling effects on how people relate to each other, and this is something I think that we want to avoid in good work, right? We want to have bad data in good work. We don't want to have the best possible data on you. We want like very bad data. But yeah, I'll stop there so we have more time for audience questions.
Great, thank you so much. I'm gonna pick questions at random. I'm sorry if I don't get to everybody's. We have about 15 minutes. The first question is from Dave Watton, which is, what advice, if any, would you give to an 18-year-old school leaver about preparing for or entering the world of work? 18-year-old school leaver, quote, I want to get a job and start earning money ASAP. Who would like to take that one first? Advice to this school leaver.
I can go very quickly on that one. I would say the important thing is to see if your workplace has a union, join one. That's the first thing you do, right? But that really isn't enough on its own. There's a couple of things more that you need to do. I guess I'm thinking what I would have liked to hear when I was in that position. Some of it is that there will be moments where it's not clear that you can say no to things, and that might actually have repercussions, right? But it's thinking about demanding, like knowing your rights and acting on them, which means talking to your fellow workers, which means making sure people are in the union. If you're not a fit, like if you don't have a recognized one, like sorting that out. It's not easy, and this stuff is quite hard to do as a young person, especially in jobs where you might not be offered more hours if you're seen as a troublemaker. So as much as I want to give the very strong unionize and radicalize your union, get involved in your branch, like this does come with risks, right? You might not be offered hours, this kind of stuff. So what you need to do to protect yourself is not only join your union, but talk to your fellow workers and really like support each other. And those conversations can be difficult, but starting with like, if people are annoyed that they're not getting the breaks they're supposed to be getting, or people are like, why do we have to pay for our uniform? Or like, why is our break room so messy? Like, why don't we have a kettle? Why do we have to buy this or that? Those are kind of good stuff to start those conversations, I think.
I would also say, find out what your boundaries are, figure out what they are, and keep those divisions as definite as you possibly can. Divide like work and leisure, and think this is time when I'm working and this is time when I'm not working. And if you can at all avoid it, don't join like social media or WhatsApp groups with people at work, apart from organizing in the workplace. But don't let your boss contact you through your phone if you can at all avoid it. Like keep those divisions there. Make sure that you have a life outside of work.
Yeah, I'd agree with what both Amelia and Kat have said. I think additionally, just be familiar with what kind of contract you're on and what your worker status actually is. Are you a full-time employee? Are you a 0-hour contract employee? And what kind of rights come along with that contract? In the UK, there are, I think, several ways to define a worker in the first place. So just being aware of, if you're being gypped on one right or another, that is legally required, make sure to have that information on hand.
Cool. Thanks, everybody. Second question, is there a way to reverse the expectation of hyper efficiency in stuff like retail? Or would you see it as a Pandora's box that can no longer be closed? Amelia, do you want to kind of start with that one?
Yeah, I think I think retail is an interesting one. I think it depends on the dynamics of the particular shop, because in shops I've worked, there's often like you have a lot of time waiting around, you have a lot of time like folding and unfolding clothes and appearing as busy, right? So it's kind of hyper efficiency in one way, but I guess there's some kind of activity, like say restaurant work, where you will, and you can't really get away from it. You do have these intense bursts of activity, right? Customers show up. So what you do is you have workers having more of a say over what their breaks look like, over what happens when that kind of stuff happens. So people aren't going home completely exhausted, completely broken, but there are some kind of jobs where bits of the service sector where that will happen. I guess the bigger problem is the hyper efficiency that comes in when people are required to work extra hard so that they know they'll be the people who get hours next week, right? So you're on a 0 hours contract. You have caring responsibilities, or alternatively, you just want to know when you're working. What you then feel like you have to do that is be the best person, be the best worker. So you can then say, okay, look, at 3:30, I've got to go pick up my kid. So one way around that is campaigning to reduce the use of these contracts. People know what hours they're working, right? So that's one way. That's one really awful mechanism for work intensification in a lot of sectors is the denial of control over time. Can it be reversed? I think it can be. I think there are always going to be moments which are super busy in any kind of in some kinds of activities, right? But what you do then is you try and build workers' control, so they can say, okay, well, if we have 1 million customers, that's what happens, but this is what we do afterwards, or that's how we handle it together.
I'm gonna take my carnival barker kind of approach again and just call somebody to reply. Kat, do you want to talk about hyper efficiency in retail or in any other sector? Related questions around productivity, anything that you want to go with there, really?
I think Amelia's answer was really good. I would also this is, I think, less important than worker control, but I do think that a lot of hyper intensification, hyper efficiency is driven by expectation and the kind of propagandizing of, again, convenience, and you as the customer deserve to have this person working incredibly hard and incredibly fast for you. So broader conversations about work and what it should look like, I think not to be education is the answer and that's it. There obviously do need to be some material changes beyond that, but yeah, I do think that broader, louder conversations need to be had about why we feel entitled to someone's time and a very, very short amount of someone's time.
Yeah, I'll just agree, obviously, with Amelia and Kat, what's already been said. I don't think I have much to add, but I would, really just echo what Kat said about this onus really is on the consumer. At some point we can demand what we want, from our workplaces. But on the flip side, we are all consumers at the same time. So we need to manage our expectations, as Kat already pointed out. And sometimes the onus is really on us to be better and us not to demand this hyper efficiency on our end. We can go around touting workers' rights, but when it comes down to it, we want our milkshake and burger super, super fast. So we need to keep that in check, definitely.
Great, thanks for that. I have a really good question here, which is, how does one balance pushing for autonomy / control in the workplace with the need to make collective decisions? So, i.e., an orchestra needs to all play the same piece and to have an audience. I think that's a really interesting question here, and it does resonate with these kind of problems of I guess, like, management in the workplace. Amelia, do you want to take that one up?
Sure, that's a brilliant question. I think there are particular kinds of activities that require something that is intensive kind of coordination of that activity, which requires everyone knowing what they're doing and doing it, and where if something doesn't happen in the right way, things can go wrong, right? So in those situations, you need you have a kind of problem where you need to coordinate people's action. How do you do that without domination happening? How do you do that without, or how do we make it so that is acceptable? So I think there are different kind of mechanisms we could use to kind of democratize that. So we don't want to have a situation in which at any moment people can say, I am democratically blocking this action, unless it's like obviously like a serious thing, right? But like in the example of an orchestra, that's unlikely. So it's thinking about like what processes, like what does that democracy look like? And I think one thing that I think we have this there's a kind of general common sense that the more democracy we have, the less efficient things will be. And I'm not sure that's true. I think there are trade-offs perhaps in some moments, but actually workers tend to have knowledge of the work processes they do that their managers don't have or haven't really thought about recently. So the way that, for example, a waitress will move about the kitchen of a restaurant is different to what someone in head office will imagine, right? So with that knowledge, the scope for the close coordination activities that is required, and that we can't just say, well, anyone can do what they want. But then we think about, okay, so if we treat it like a kind of self-governing organization in which people can raise concerns, in which people can collectively shape those decisions, that might have to be after the fact or before the fact rather than in that moment itself. I think there's a lot of scope, and workers have a lot of knowledge about the way in which they work. So it's a question of helping people. I guess it comes up to this question of genuine empowerment, right? Of making people aware of that knowledge, of making people aware of their ability to shape and improve like the way things work in their workplace.
We're running quickly out of time. Kat and Kulsoom, can we get a quick comment from both of you? Maybe Kat to start.
Yes, I'm gonna put this is maybe quite a dampener of a comment, but just quickly on the notion of control and knowledge. I think that it's important to recognize the effect that Taylorism has had on certain kinds of workplaces and certain kinds of worker knowledge. So if you look back at a kind of more artisanal time when people would build a whole chair versus building like the parts of a chair and having like expert knowledge on how to build one chair leg, but when you look at the chair as a whole, it's impossible to with the knowledge you have of the chair leg build the whole chair. And that's how the production line is increasingly working. It's also how workers in non-production line capacities and workplaces are increasingly working with knowledge of a very, very tiny part of the company. So I think that it would be incredibly useful, incredibly powerful for people to talk to each other about the kinds of work that they're doing and the kinds of like instinctive things they know about the work they're doing, to then form like a bigger picture of what work looks like as a whole in their workplace. Because a waitress knowing their way around the kitchen or in a particular restaurant, that doesn't map quite exactly onto the way that work works in a lot of spaces now in terms of worker knowledge. So it's a bit of a depressing situation, but I do think it is reversible. But it's recognizing that knowledge just has been atomized as much as people have been atomized.
Great, thank you so much. Kulsoom, do you want to throw anything in there?
Sure. Yeah, I think that Amelia in the book gives a really good example as well about how companies no longer kind of promote floor workers up to kind of more executive positions, right? In order to decrease exactly that understanding of what the shop floor is actually like. And that, just to throw another wrench in the mix is another thing we definitely need to be battling. Like, it does matter that folks at the top have experience of what it's like to be a worker. And then, yes, just totally echo Amelia and Kat. I mean, workplace democracy. Democracy is not always efficient, but you also need to do it in order to, have a solid base to go off of. Yeah, I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Cool. Well, thank you so much to all the panelists. I'm sorry to anybody whose question we didn't get to, but a lot of these are taken up in Amelia's book. So I would recommend that you buy it. And also continue reading all three of the panelists, the work that they put out and the organizing they're doing, continue following that, because I think these are really relevant concerns and they are being taken up. Thank you so much to Pluto, to Kieran, and to Varushka for hosting today. We really appreciate it. It'll be on YouTube, as I understand it. Thank you so much. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.